Our guest today is Nadia Ahidjo. Nadia is a global development professional specializing in the application of gender analysis in philanthropy, advocacy, and policy work. She has over 13 years experience supporting women's rights organizations in numerous countries and across all regions of Africa. Nadia is currently working as the program manager for girls' education in emergencies at Equal Measures 2030. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nadia.
Thanks, Ali. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Nadia, I understand that EM2030 has been working to better understand the data landscape and to map opportunities for girls' education in Kenya and Burkina Faso. Now, could you tell us a bit about EM2030's project on girls' education in emergencies and your work with data at the global, regional, and national level?
Sure. So for those who don't know about Equal Measures 2030, we work at the intersection of women's rights organization and data, so gender equality and data. And we really do a lot of work around supporting women's rights organizations with advocacy, with capacity support, with research, and just with tracking of the gender equality in different countries and in different contexts, because we firmly believe that women's rights organizations have important roles to play in decision-making spaces, and unfortunately, they are not present enough in these spaces for multiple reasons that you're all aware of. For this project in particular, we're actually looking at education systems in Burkina Faso and in Kenya, and just thinking about how to make them data-driven, but also gender responsive. We found in our work that most decision-making around education in countries could be data-driven, but there are a lot of gaps and challenges with the data. And a lot of the times, actually, these systems are not gender responsive. They tend to be gender blind almost for different reasons, which is quite a shame. And so a lot of the work that we're doing in Kenya and in Burkina Faso is to really first support women's rights organizations in both countries to effectively advocate, right, for equitable access for girls and women in emergency context. And so, for example, in Kenya, this is displaced persons or host communities that host IDPs or refugees. In Burkina Faso, we're looking at communities that have been affected by terrorism. And we're also working with decision makers because we also noticed that there's a gap in the use of quality data and evidence by decision makers, especially relating to education for girls and women in emergency context. So that's also an area that we're trying to improve on through this project.
Thanks for giving us that overview, Nadia. So one of the main themes of data feminism is power, because in today's world, data is a form of power. And so it's important that we examine and challenge existing power structures and how data might uphold these hierarchies. Now, it's my understanding that presently the National Emergency Coordination is strongly weighted in favor of international organizations rather than grassroots women's rights organizations, which you've already alluded to. Now, I'm wondering, in your experience, why is this a problem, and what is the value of involving women's rights organizations in this work?
So what we're finding, right, what you realize is that emergencies in general are the work of organizations and of stakeholders and even of government is service-driven. So it's always, we urgently need to get education to people, water, etc. And so it tends to favor organizations that have huge presence and resources and capacities. In most contexts, this is UN agencies and international organizations and some government stakeholders. And so in these contexts, you find that decisions are made pretty quickly, decisions that have medium to long-term impacts, but that don't necessarily involve people who are based in communities that are affected by the issues. And for us, this is a huge gap. I mean, how do you invest in education in a community that's been affected by terrorism, but you haven't consulted anybody from that community? We know that in most contexts, grassroots associations and women's rights organizations are usually the first responders, right? They're the ones who are present when things happen, and they're the ones who can account, and they're the ones who communities feel closer to, and who communities who understand also the lived realities, right, of these communities. And so there's sort of a dissonance in providing services and support to communities without necessarily consulting them or involving them or even having them own some of these processes. And you find that in the medium to longer term, also it affects policymaking and decision making on these issues, but it's still done in this vacuum where huge members of communities that are respondents, that are supposed to implement these decisions are active. So that's sort of the challenge that we're finding, but it's also a reflection of international development politics as a whole, and it's not necessarily just in education in emergencies. And what we're finding, for example, in Burkina Faso, there's only one women's rights organization there's an EIE cluster that makes decisions. And even when we surveyed policymakers who are part of this cluster and who should know all the members of the cluster because they're what, like 21 or 22, they said, the only women's rights organization that we know that's working on this stuff is FAWE, but we're not really sure what it is exactly that they do. And that tells you really also, like, there seems to be this expectation that women's rights organizations should go towards policymakers and decision makers, but do they even have the access to these spaces or even the capacity, right? Because if you're going to be participating in conversations that involve policy making, that involve service delivery, then you have to have the data that will allow you to actually tell the story, and a story that is the reality of many people as opposed to anecdotes. And so I also think that that's sort of some of the challenges that they face beyond the resources aspect as well. Yeah.
Okay, I see. And so because these organizations, these women's rights organizations, the grassroots organizations, are closer to the community feels more comfortable talking to them. It's so important that they're included in a more in-depth level because they are the ones who can uplift the voices of those who are most vulnerable and those who are affected in that community.
And even beyond that, it's also a language thing, right? You look at countries like Kenya, where there are many languages spoken. It's not just English, there's Swahili. In Turkana, the area where we have our project, people speak Turkana, but you have decisions that are made on girls' education in these contexts that are made in English, or in Swahili, languages that grassroots communities and affected communities don't understand. And yet these organizations are supposed to support these agencies in delivering these services and government stakeholders in making decisions around teacher training, around, all kinds of things that relate to education in these contexts. So it's these kinds of gaps and nuances and contextual realities that women's rights organizations really fill. And that's the value in including them in some of these processes.
That's so interesting. I definitely wouldn't have thought of all those nuances, but of course it makes sense. So of course, these larger organizations have more resources, and as a result, they can collect more, I'm hesitant to say better, but they can collect more data. So I'm wondering, what role does data play in upholding this power that these organizations have, and how can we leverage data to shift power from international organizations to those grassroots women's rights organizations on the ground?
In our experience with this project, and when I say our, I mean Equal Measures, but also our partners, FAWE Kenya and FAWE Regional, but also IPBF in Burkina Faso, we find that, yes, these agencies and government stakeholders, of course, collect data. But at the end of the day, this data, number one, usually it's collected by a consultant, right? That's been hired to go somewhere and collect the data. So most of the time, the data is collected via translation, for example, via a translator. And so a lot of information is lost. There are also translations that don't reflect something that somebody was actually saying when they're collecting data. The other thing that we find is that the data isn't disaggregated at all. They're not able to tell you, like you do have some research that's done that tries to look at how many girls are affected versus how many boys, etc. But to be honest, the bulk of the data is not disaggregated. So even when you go to these repositories of data to be able to understand what's going on and make decisions, you're actually not able to know boys and girls are seen as like one thing. And even minus that, like, can you think about now children who live with disabilities, for example, or people living with disabilities, they're completely lost in this data collection. When you think about non-binary individuals, they're completely taken out of this because everything is seen as this big blob and you're collecting data without really understanding the lived realities of people. So at the end of the day, the response doesn't make sense and it's likely not as effective as it should be. So I think that there's that comes up a lot. The other thing is in terms of, you do find some like grassroots organizations and women's rights organizations that collect data, but because they don't necessarily have the skills or the resources or the time to dedicate, you will find that the quality of the data may not be what's expected or what's needed to input into like national policy making processes, or you'll find that the data is outdated, for example. You find that quite a lot. So usually you find that decisions are made based on data that was collected like 5 years before. And so it's not really a response to an actual situation. I mean, there are lots of challenges, but I really think that there's a critical role that data can play in just telling stories, but stories that reflect realities that can push us to actually make decisions that make sense for people, right? And that affect their daily lives. And for me, I think with this kind of project, it's feeding those into where those gaps exist at national and regional levels. Like EM2030, we have our index that we do where we track gender equality commitments related to the SDGs for different countries. And we do try to fill some of these gaps by showing, okay, women feel, if we continue like this, for example, like women are never going to feel safe walking alone at night, that kind of thing. And it's really telling a story that is interesting, but also that relies on data that is real and that has actually been collected by people who understand the realities and in which this data is being collected.
On the topic of data quality and telling a story with your data, can you talk a bit about how having disaggregated data relates to intersectionality and capturing the different factors that influence how people face the world and the obstacles that they may uniquely face?
Sure. I mean, I'll give a simple example, right? This current project that we're working on is on girls' education. And you find that, when you look at some of the graphs, for example, and the data, you'll see that they show you that, in primary school, you find girls and boys sort of like 50-50%, right? And then as they progress and they get into secondary school, for example, you see a huge drop of girls participating or coming back to school. And a lot of the barriers in this sense to girls' education, for example, relates to in school, but also out of school factors. Things like child marriage, things like, parents in some contexts, especially in impoverished contexts, prioritizing boys' education, cultural norms, that kind of thing. And so I think that it's important to have disaggregated data because you can begin to understand in specific communities what the barriers are and how to tackle the barriers. For example, if many girls at adolescence are not going to school because they don't have access to quality SRHR, sexual reproductive health and rights, then that's a problem. If you can provide menstrual goods at schools, then you're already fixing part of the problem, right? Part of the issues that prevent girls from attending school. And this is just a small example, but it's really important to have that disaggregation so that you really understand that people especially children and young girls and young women face different challenges. Sometimes they face similar challenges, as like when it relates, for example, to teachers and that kind of thing. But oftentimes they also face different challenges, and to be able to address their challenges, you have to know who they are and what they face. You find even, for example, a lot now, even more so in refugee camps, for example, and in IDP camps, there are non-binary children. I mean, this is not a secret, right? But nobody's collecting data. And also, I mean, it's a safety issue. If you don't know, then how can you protect? Because we're talking about child protection here, right? But how can you protect if you don't know? Thinking about people living with disabilities, it's the same thing. It's really difficult to go to a government or to an agency that's not specialized on people living with disabilities and to know actually how many children living with disabilities live in a specific camp. And how do you make sure that they can go to school? Something that simple. And so I think these are some of the questions that come up, and this is where a lot of the investment needs to go, because we need to think bigger and we need to think beyond, or, we need to know how many boys and how many girls go to school. No, it's not that. There are different intersecting identities, and there's a need to really think carefully about what these different identities are and how we can acknowledge all of them in the data that we collect, irrespective of who we are. And I feel that grassroots organizations and women's rights organizations who live in these communities have this information, but because they don't have the capacity or the resources to actually document it and feed it into national decision-making processes, we are not making decisions that really address or allow us to address issues on a long term and actually allow us to change the way things are done, right, in a way that will be positive in the medium to long term.
What you're speaking of right now reminds me of this article that I recently read. It was written from the point of view of an individual who identifies as non-binary, and they were advocating for the collection of more disaggregated data, specifically when it comes to gender. So not just having options of male and female, but male, female, non-binary, and beyond. And what she said that's really interesting, or what they said rather, that's really interesting is in their advocacy efforts, they get the response quite often that, oh, there aren't enough of you for it to be valuable for us to collect that data. And their response is, how do you know how many of us there are if you don't collect the data? So it just goes to show how important that data collection is to really get the full picture of that story.
Yeah, definitely. And if you're going to be, and here's the thing, right, about policymakers is that if you're going to be advocating for a policymaker to make a decision, the first question they're going to ask you is how many people? It's great to come and tell the story of this one person. And this is what, unfortunately, women's rights and grassroots organizations do very well. They tell lots of stories. But once you start asking for numbers, which is what, unfortunately, policymakers tend to do, they don't have them. And so it's also a thing of like, how do we account for everybody in a way that will push policymakers to make decisions? Because that's where the power currently lies, right? So how do you really bring policymakers to a place where they understand that there are different dynamics that are involved in decision making, and that they have to be able to account for and respect everybody, and to be able for them to also be able to interpret and read the data and ask this kind of question, because sometimes also policymakers don't ask these questions, right, when they receive the data and when they have to start passing laws and stuff.
Exactly. Very, very true. Now, Nadia, I think a question that we all have, speaking of girls' education and emergencies and the current landscape, the global landscape that we're living in, what has been the impact of COVID on girls' education and emergencies?
I'll tell you one thing is that, number one is that the data isn't being collected. So anybody who's telling you right now that COVID has worsened everything, yes, they are right, but they're not able to tell you by how much or where specifically it's been and what it looks like across different contexts. So everything that we tell you when we're talking about how COVID has aggravated barriers and access to quality education is based on anecdotal information, but it's also sometimes based on experiences with other similar pandemics like Ebola, or SARS, the first edition of SARS. So I would say there's that. A lot of it is assumptions. What we have been finding through this project, with the little data that we've been able to collect, is that, in some countries, schools were shut down. So to be honest, most persons don't have access to TV, where most of the education programs were on television, others were on radio. But if you have a household where there's only one radio, and it's usually the father who has the radio, then you don't have access to school. Others were online, and this is what a really small percentage of middle class and upper middle class persons who have access to data, just so that they can go to school. So this is what happened when schools were closed. But even when schools reopen, in some contexts, you'll find that economically it wasn't sustainable for many families to send all their children to school. So many would prioritize boy children, and they'd keep the girls at home to help with childcare, to help in the market, that kind of thing. Again, all of this is anecdotal information. And what we do know is that in the next 5 years, the estimates that we had for the number of children that would be enrolled in primary and secondary school are definitely going to be way less, because they have been affected globally and not just in Africa by COVID. The other thing that you're also finding is that many, and I'm sorry, my connection is unstable, but what we're also finding is that in many contexts, pushed a lot of families to marry their young girls way faster than they had to, even though, this maybe wasn't intentional. So I think the repercussions are much more damaging than we assume right now. And we will only know for sure if we begin to collect the data, because for now, I don't think there's enough effort or resources that's put into collecting data relating to COVID specifically. But also, we'll have to look at the impact around the trends relating to how many children actually are enrolled in school or are able to stay in school.
Are you particularly excited about any non-traditional data sources, such as citizen-generated data or administrative data, that may help us track the effects of COVID-19 on girls' education during COVID in more real time?
I think so. I would say, I mean, this is, I would say, I think a lot of organizations, especially smaller research organizations that are based on the continent, track this data and are producing reports. And so it's also a thing of mapping who these organizations are and being able to read some of these stories. But also we're finding that organizations like INE, for example, their Mind the Gap reports that they release annually also are starting to include elements around COVID. So I would say to really get more information around what's happening with COVID relating to education in emergencies, I think INE is a good resource, especially because they source their data from across the world because they're a global network. Those are from the top of my mind, those are the top two that I can think about.
Great, thank you for sharing. Okay, so that concludes the discussion portion of this lounge, and we would now like to open the floor to the audience for the Q&A session. If you have a question for Nadia, feel free to either raise your hand or use the chat function if you're more comfortable with that, and I will facilitate from there. Yes, Elettra, go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming. It's great hearing from you. I'm Elettra. I had Ali's question in mind. So going off of Ali's question, do you know how, after you have those alternative data sources coming into or talking about COVID or gender data in refugee camps or in areas that are conflict zones where it's really hard to have national statistical offices on the ground and it's expensive to have enumerators and whatnot. Is there any initiatives that worked with grassroots organizations and then integrated within the National Statistical Office to make sure that it was recognized nationally? Or any initiatives where you saw collaboration between the National Statistical Office and grassroots organizations or nonprofits on the ground, or advocacy groups as well?
Hi, Elettra. I can't think of any specifically, but I do know that in both Burkina Faso and in Kenya, there are EIE clusters or EIE working groups that have government entities that collect data, but also international agencies that collect data. And they tend to work with national chapters or local consultants to collect data. So I would say that some of their data, not all of it, does have insights from grassroots organizations or certain women's rights organizations, but it's difficult to know which, and it's actually also the decision of what goes into the reports and what is shared isn't made by the women's rights organizations, right? So the priorities that are shared sometimes may not necessarily reflect the realities on the ground. So at this point in time, I really can't think of any specific, data that would point to that. But for the project that I'm currently working on, we will be releasing a policy report early next year. If you sign up to our newsletter, you'll get information on when this launch is happening, and we will have more contextual data on Kenya and Burkina Faso. It is true that it's not at the range or the size that these bigger entities produce, but it actually does already show some of the nuances that exist and the kinds of things to look into when looking at huge data that's collected by the larger entities. I hope this helps a little bit.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for answering that question.
Thank you for your question, Elettra. Do I see any more hands raised or questions in the chat? I'll give you all another few seconds. I know it can be nerve-wracking to ask questions live, but this is a great opportunity to connect with Nadia virtually, face-to-face.
Meanwhile, we're thinking, I'd also like to challenge everyone to take, we have a girls' education quiz that we launched in October, I believe. And I mean, everybody needs to take that quiz because you assume that you know so much about, girls' education across the African continent in any case. And once you take that quiz, you suddenly realize, okay, oh my God, maybe some of these assumptions I'd been making aren't the best. And it also provides, especially thinking about Elettra's question, it also provides links to other resources to deepen understanding on some of the issues or some of the questions raised in the quiz. So yeah, it's on our Equal Measures website and also I think Twitter. I'll find the link and share that with Ali, and she can always share with all participants later.
Nadia, is that the how much do you know about gender equality in the world today quiz?
No, so that's a separate one. That's a broader gender equality one, but we have a specific one that's just on girls' education in sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, great. We'll find that link and email it out to everyone who registered for this lounge. Okay, well, that looks like all of the questions today. Nadia, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. It was a great conversation that left me feeling inspired and empowered.
Thank you, Ali. It was a pleasure to be here. And thanks everyone for joining and for listening in.
Now, before signing off, I'm just going to talk about one of our upcoming events, which is actually tonight at 5:30 p.m. PST. We have our November book club. We are reading The Costs of Connection by Nick Couldry and Ulises Mejia. Yes, I hope that's how you say it. And it's about how data is colonizing human life and appropriating it for capitalism. It's going to be a great discussion. Even if you haven't read the book, we have some resources on our social media pages, some videos you can watch just to get familiar with the concepts covered, and you can totally participate in the discussion nonetheless. So that is tonight at 5:30 p.m. PST. There is a link in the chat to sign up for that. So that concludes our lounge today. Thanks again to our special guest, Nadia. We really appreciate you being here.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.